Okay, we'll get going with some intros just from us, and I will basically then hand over it to our panel from City Bridge Foundation. So yeah, warm welcome. Really nice to see so many of you. My name's Helen. I'm one of the directors at London Funders. And we'll just be kind of introducing the session, which, as you know, is part of our Festival of Learning. We're now in week 2, and it's been really fantastic. Lots of sessions, seeing so many of our members coming together to share learning, discuss what you've been working on, challenge and inspire each other. So thank you so much for your continued engagement through all of those sessions. And really pleased that we've got such a good one lined up with City Bridge Foundation. Today, looking at lessons from funding infrastructure and systems change long term. We are using social media throughout the festival. You'll know the drill if you've been to a session already, the hashtag of Festival of Learning 24. We'll put it in the chat anyway, so that if you do want to get involved on social media, please do. And also, final plug for any final sessions, the last closing event is on Thursday this week. So yeah, feel free to join any other sessions, particularly the final event on Thursday, where we'll be doing lots of networking in person as well. So do join us for that. I've lost you all on my screen, but I'm going to hand over now. We've got 4 speakers from City Bridge Foundation who are going to share this session. So Nat, over to you.
Thank you, Helen. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. My name's Nat Jordan. I am one of 2 heads of the Propel programme at City Bridge Foundation, alongside my counterpart who's also presenting with me today. That's Shegufta Slawther. I think on the next slide, we don't have pictures of us, but we do have pictures of our colleagues also, Clara and Khadra, who lead up the Anchor programme here. So by way of introduction to City Bridge, if you're not familiar with us, we're a 900-year-old charity, and we own and manage 5 Thames crossings. You are probably familiar with Tower Bridge, and we do that through our charitable funds at no cost to the taxpayer. We also support, once we've met all our obligations to do with the bridges, London's communities by awarding over £30 million a year to charities across the capital. So just to kick off with a little bit of housekeeping, as you'll be able to see, this session is in meeting format. So if you've got your cameras on, hopefully we'll be able to see you. I don't think we have a Q&A, but we do have a chat active. So if you've got any questions as we go along, you can put them in there, and we'll also have time at the end if you want to turn your mute off and chip in with any of those questions. We'll try our best to answer them. In terms of what we're going to talk to you about today, I'll start off by telling you a little bit about what the history within City Bridge Foundation has been in terms of our relationship to long-term funding, and an introduction to 2 of the programmes in which we're trying to introduce it, which is the Propel and the Anchor programmes. Both of these programmes have featured some extent co-design in different ways in terms of our approach to that long-term funding, and each to some extent, although Anchor does exclusively, funds infrastructure organisations and buy-in for or user-led organisations. So we'll touch on what we're starting to learn from working with those through these processes, including how being relational has been, or an attempt to be more relational than we normally are, is a key part to how we're maintaining those relationships over the long term. So why are we interested in long-term funding at City Bridge? Well, at the heart of our interest is our mission to achieve change for Londoners at both a system-wide and system change level, and that's given that's because our mission ultimately is to end inequality in London, and we recognise that this can only really be achieved by dealing with the causes of inequality themselves, which tend to be systemic. Our responsive programmes do deal with the effects of disadvantage itself as well, and that is a really important part of what we do. But the strategic programmes that we introduced, like our participation in Propel and the Anchor programme, aim to address some of those systems change issues. We've also learned from previous strategic programmes that we've participated in, including our support for a place-based giving initiative called London Giving, a learning report from which highlighted that in many cases it can be 7 to 10 years before an intervention can truly begin to demonstrate its impact. So funding over the long term really enables to reach those points. Some other benefits of long-term funding that we're aware of is funding over an extended period provides a greater opportunity to build a lasting relationship with the organisations that we fund, and this in turn allows for the maximisation of the potential for the benefit of our total assets. So that gives us more time with organisations to develop rapport, really get to know those organisations and the context that they're working in depth, and hopefully then identify further opportunities to leverage other support. So whether that's through our Funder Plus offer, which we call the Bridge Programme, or whether that's through, for instance, the assets of our trustee, the City of London, and all of the expertise that sits within that, or other opportunities, including partner funds. On the other hand, we're aware that shorter term funding comes with a lot of pitfalls. It requires a lot of ongoing funding requirements, particularly fundraising, requirements, particularly of the organisations that we fund, who are continually having to either reapply to us or apply across different funders to continue projects continuously. This can cause things like mission drift if they're trying to meet changing requirements within one funder, or they're trying to sort of cater to different emphases of different funders, which in the long term can also create difficulty tracking outcomes over an extended period of time. It's also worth noting that long-term funding is simply something that the sector has communicated to us that it needs for a long time, and for us to show that we're really listening to what the sector wants. Many of the reasons above apply in terms of the reasons why voluntary sector organisations have been asking us for this, but it really demonstrates our commitment to responding to the feedback that we're hearing. I've just included a quote here from a report that's a few years old now, but I think it still stands true today. It's by a US-based organisation called Ashoka, and it's from their report, Embracing Complexity Towards a Shared Understanding of Systems Change. And they note that systemic funders are realistic about the time that it takes to achieve systems change. 55% of systems change leaders that they interviewed felt that funders do not currently provide the necessary multi-year timeline necessary to achieve it. Systems change usually involves collaboration with a broad range of partners, which can take a long time to establish. Systemic funders thus accommodate these extended timelines. So, what is our own history of delivering long-term funding? So, in our mainstream programs, we've delivered up to 5 years continuous funding ever since the introduction of our current strategy in 2018, which is called Bridging Divides. We do sometimes fund for a shorter period of time, but we try to make that the exception rather than the rule, and it would only be if there's specific circumstances relating to a given grant that we would fund in the shorter term than that. Our strategy, Bridging Divides, when it was introduced, committed us both to short and long-term funding, but then it never really defined exactly what we meant by those two terms. It set an exceptional maximum for a full period of funding of 10 years. So we were able to do that. Essentially, it was our trustees' prerogative to award for the long term. So we did therefore do that on occasion, but not necessarily within a planned programme that intended to do that from the start. So what cases have we delivered long-term funding through before? So there's been some sporadic longer-term funding relationships prior to these programmes, and they were primarily in funding to infrastructure organisations. We've been a funder of second-tier organisations for a long time. We recognise their importance within the context of London's voluntary ecosystem, and part of recognising that importance is that they've been eligible to apply for continuation funding repeatedly without necessarily requiring a gap in funding that applies to the majority of our organisations. So many organisations, for example, who are trying to return to us to fund the same work would normally have to wait for 2 years to do that following the end of their grant. That's not been true for infrastructure organisations. But what this has meant in practice with infrastructure organisations who have been funded for up to that 10 continuous years is that those organisations have had to undergo 3 or more full application processes in that time, without necessarily having had a plan for transition out of that cycle, for instance, having to go through the full whack of the whole assessment process each time before they start to then hit that theoretical 10 years threshold. We only have one prior instance to these programs we're going to talk to you about today of funding 10 years all at once, and that was through one exceptional grant. Then during the COVID pandemic, we underwent an interim review of the Bridging Divide strategy, which alongside a historic uplift in available funding, enabled us to commit to two major programs. So the first is the Anchor program, which offers 7 to 10 years core funding to infrastructure organisations, and the other, which I'll describe in a bit more detail now, before handing over to my Anchor colleagues to give you a full background of the Anchor program, is the Propel program. This hasn't yet made full longer-term grant commitments at the moment, but as a 10-year program is likely to involve continuous funding over 10 years for a majority of organisations. So future rounds under development may offer up to 7 years funding on top of, for example, an initial 3 years. So, as mentioned, there are a couple of similarities between Propel and Anchor, but Propel is an internal City Bridge Foundation initiative. It's a partnership funding programme to which we're significant collaborators, which is convened by London funders and involves a number of other funding organisations, and is focused on enabling civil society groups and organisations to explore, develop and lead approaches to tackle some of London's biggest challenges. We have committed £30 million to the programme over 10 years, and City Bridge Foundation individually has spent just under £8 million of that 30 million commitment. Admittedly, the longest grants that we've committed to, as I mentioned, yet are 3 years, but we've embarked on these relationships with an understanding that many, if not most of these organisations will have an up to 10-year relationship with the collaboration as a whole, and organisations are then able to set their ambitions for systems change with that in mind. So ultimately, Propel is about collaboration, recognising that the challenges we face are too big for any one funder, charity or community to tackle on their own, and our shared ambition is to build long-term collaborations that draw on the strengths and assets of all of us so that we can tackle the issues facing them together. I'm just going to hand over to Clara, who's going to introduce the Anchor programme.
Thanks, Nat. So in terms of the Anchor programme, at the heart of this programme is a commitment to achieve change for Londoners at a systemic level. The fund aims to achieve this by providing long-term core funding over a period of 7 to 10 years to organisations that provide second-tier support to frontline organisations. So we launched the pilot last year, and we've just launched the second and final round. In total, there's £30 million of funding in the pot, and we spent roughly £14 million in the first round. The planning for this programme started back in 2021, and it was co-designed with civil society organisations. We'll touch on that a little bit later on about co-design. So the aim of the programme is to support organisations that can demonstrate that their work is led by and for, and that they are supporting organisations that work with historically marginalised groups. Organisations can apply for a minimum of £50,000 per year and a maximum of £150,000 per year. So that means that the largest grants that we awarded last year were £1.5 million over 10 years. So how did this fund come about? The pandemic gave us the opportunity to fund differently, which meant that the conditions of COVID allowed us to adapt much faster than we would have done under normal circumstances. This also meant that we were able to test and trial new ways of funding as we emerged from the lockdowns. We were privileged to be in a position where we were able to trial new ways of working, and that is due to the additional £200 million of funding that we had from our investments that we needed to spend down. Now we wanted to, as I mentioned before, we recognize that we are in a unique position to be able to offer long-term funding, and we just wanted to gauge how many of you on this call are awarding long-term funding. So I think Jess has shared a poll. I saw it appear.
Yeah, it should be there for everybody.
Fab, thank you. So we're asking, how many years of funding do you award? Is it up to 1 year? or between 1 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, or over 10 years. Okay. And also, if you can't access the poll, please feel free to write in the chat. And if you wouldn't mind sharing in the chat the reason why you are or why you're not awarding long-term funding, that would be great. I can't see the poll or the results. I don't know if it appeared on my screen. I think I crossed it because I was reading and.
Let me make you a co-host. It should have popped up on everyone's screen. Just let me know if it hasn't.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Eric. I can see that you wrote in the chat that John Lyons has been given grants up to 5 years from April 2023 and that you were previously awarding 3 years. I can't see the results.
Do you want us to read it out, Clara?
If that's possible.
I think
that'd be great.
Most people have completed it by now. So there were 4 options.
Okay.
Up to 1 year, and that was 15% of people who answered the poll. The most common by a long way was 1 to 5 years. So 82% of you fund 1 to 5 years. 5 to 10, that was 9% of you are funding somewhere between 5 to 10, and nobody currently for more than 10 years.
Okay.
So that, by far the majority within that 1 to 5 year mark. I know there's a couple of comments in the chat too, Clara, but hopefully, that gives a sense of what people are currently doing.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thanks for everyone commenting in the chat. That's really good to know. I'm going to hand over to Khadra now.
Thanks, Clara.
Thank you.
So that's a really interesting result. It seems like a lot of people are in a similar boat to us in terms of awarding up to 5 years of funding, which is what we did previously. So what does 10-year funding look like in practice? So we're at the early stage of awarding 10-year grants, but we wanted to share some of our initial learnings. Awarding long-term core funding at Citybridge Foundation is quite similar to our standard practice. We still follow the application process as usual, asking applicants to complete an online form. The only difference with the Anchor programme is that we do a 2-stage process, including an expression of interest stage. We then carry out our usual due diligence process and create an assessment report following an assessment visit, which is then reviewed by our charity finance team to look at more closely and to kind of understand the financial health of an organisation. This report is then shared with our committee and board for final sign-off. So we expect organisations to also follow our usual reporting mechanisms, although we are trying to pilot a different way of monitoring these grants, as they are core funding and over such a long period of time, compared to our usual kind of funding that's around project funding and up to 5 years of funding. Alongside the usual annual reporting we have planned, we hope to also design in 3-year check-in points. This is to allow organisations to pivot and adapt their grant or budget as they see fit in response to any changes to the organisation itself, as well as any economic, kind of political and societal shifts that we see. So as you can see, our processes of managing a 10-year grant doesn't differ greatly from our usual grant management of up to 5 years of funding, other than our ambitions to be more flexible, to take into consideration an ever-changing landscape over such a long grant period. One feature of the Anchor programme, however, is that is unique, is that we're working with the Social Innovation Partnership, also known as TSIP, who act as our learning partner, supporting us to collect learnings over the next 2 years to better understand what it means to manage 10-year grants. They will also support funding managers and the first cohort of successful anchor grantees on their grant journeys. I'll now pass on to Nat, who will share more about long-term funding under Propel.
Thanks, Khadra. So as I mentioned earlier, Propel so far has only made initial 1 to 3 year grants, depending primarily on how developed an organisation or its partnerships programs of work that are targeting a change to their identified systems issue are. These broadly fell into 2 categories of grants. So the first was a 12-month grant that we called an Explore grant. And these were for up to £50,000. And this was designed to allow for additional capacity for exploratory work for organisations who might have a systemic issue in mind that they want to work to combat, but might not have had the capacity within their ongoing core delivery to either conduct the research or establish the partnerships or otherwise build the base of that activity. And the other strand of funding that was available was for up to 3 years. This was called Deliver and Develop funding, and this was for more established programs of work to receive a significant investment of up to £500,000 a year to, please forgive the pun, I don't know why I wrote this into my script, but I just propel that work onwards. As in the Anchor programme, one of CityBridge's major priorities within Propel was to ensure that our funding was reaching organisations that are led by and for the communities that they serve. And because of that, the majority of grants that we made were in that Explore category, where we wanted to focus on organisations that might be smaller grassroots organisations who've historically had less capacity, in general, less access to funding, and therefore perhaps less time to really do research and develop partnerships that are necessary for doing systemic work. So the majority in number of grants, so 23 out of 33 grants that we awarded through the first round of Propel were Explore grants. Clearly, these are short-term grants, so you'd be right to ask why I'm going about them in a presentation on long-term funding. It's because we have set out our ambitions within our contribution to Propel, and the Propel collaboration has in general set out our ambition to support longer-term opportunities, as the programme is for up to 10, it's a 10-year programme. And we intend ultimately that the processes for continuation, once these initial grants come to an end, are really led by the cohort of grantees that are involved, that are really flexible to meet the development of the work where it is, and recognise that our attitude to our traditional processes has to be different, for instance, not necessarily requiring traditional form-based reapplication where organisations have to go through quite the same level of reassessment for further funding. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about one of the ways in which we're doing that for extending our Explore grants a little bit later. Shegufta's going to talk about that. But in essence, these one-year grants are going through a much lighter touch process to extend them. And as our full cohort of grants then come to an end together, we expect this to, in the majority, be in the first quarter of 2026. We'll be looking at how to commit longer term funding to those that are proving to be initially successful over then potentially a period of up to 7 years at once. So in contrast to Anchor, Propel has a much more stepped approach to longer term funding at the moment, which allows for some initial investment as ideas are tested and uplifted, but with a framing of that longer term ambition. Clara, I'm going to hand back to you.
Thanks, Nat. So in terms of what work needs to be done to move towards long-term funding, first of all, it's important to move away from seeing it as risky, but rather an investment. Over the couple of years when we were planning the Anchor programme, we drip-fed information to our funding committee, and we focus on the benefits of 10-year grants and the impact that previous strategic grants have had that we've funded in the past. And we also used research to show the importance of providing long-term core funding and tackling systemic issues. And as Nat mentioned earlier, there's lots of evidence in the sector to show the benefits of awarding long-term funding. We kept the committee up to date with how the co-design process was going. We communicated any positive feedback we received or areas of improvement, and we also shared our learnings with them. We reassured them that if things didn't go to plan, we have processes in place to pause or withdraw the grants like we would do with any of our grants, and that our standard due diligence checks still applied. We reminded them that there's plenty of evidence to show that in order to ensure sustainability of organisations, we need to be awarding long-term funding. And moving towards long-term funding is about trusting organisations more, recognising that they're the experts in their field. It was also important for us to prepare the funding manager team who would be assessing these applications so that they felt equipped to assess long-term grants and to ensure that they had the confidence to do so. And all of the above can also apply to if you're moving towards awarding core funding rather than project funding. So in terms of co-design, how did we co-design the funding programs like Propel and the Anchor program with civil society organisations? So the co-design process started in February 2022, and it involved an initial roundtable session with leading infrastructure organisations. And we used this space to introduce the concept of the Anchor programme. This was then followed by a series of co-design sessions, advisory panel sessions, and a shortlisting panel with the support of an external facilitator. So what did the co-design involve? The co-design element involved asking 22 organisations doing the work on the ground to tell us what are the biggest challenges they're facing in the sector, what are their hopes for the future, and what are the things that funders could be doing differently. These conversations contributed to the vision and the principles of the fund. We also used the support of an advisory panel to really help us to operationalize the program. So we looked at the type of questions we should be asking in the application form. We asked, should it be a two-stage application process, which we did end up doing in the end, and this is new for CityBridge Foundation. We asked them what the communication strategy should look like. And as a result, we included an FAQ page on our website. We wrote a couple of blogs about the programme and our learnings so far. And we also organised pre-application webinars before launching each round. We couldn't fully commit to the co-design process since we do have certain decision-making structures in place, which means decisions ultimately go to our funding committee and board. However, we introduced a sifting panel made up of 4 frontline organisations who would likely receive support from infrastructure organisations to help us sift the applications, and we will be doing the same thing in the second round of the Anchor programme. I'll now hand over to Khadra to talk about our learnings.
So one of the key learnings from our experience of co-designing with the sector is that good co-design takes time. As funders, we know that it's important to be agile and move quickly to support organisations to overcome some of the biggest challenges facing Londoners. However, systems change and co-design work is complex. It's not a linear process and it can take a long time, 2 years in our experience, and it's important to embrace the complex nature. We had to remind ourselves during the process, if it feels challenging, then it's a sign that we're doing it right, because after all, who ever heard of comfortable change? Another important component of co-design is building trust with stakeholders, specifically building trust at the start of the journey, which means taking time to get to know the people in the room and not just focusing on the task at hand. We did this by having in-person meetings where possible and creating an informal space to get to know each other, rather than just relying on short icebreakers to achieve this level of trust or familiarity. We made it a point to be transparent and honest throughout the process, reminding all stakeholders that we were kind of launching a pilot round of the programme, which meant it was also a learning opportunity for us, and that it might feel messy at first, which again is also kind of a good reminder to tell ourselves in the team at CityBridge Foundation. So this feeling of messy was mostly experienced by us when trying to implement new processes within our existing systems. Finally, it's a really good idea to partner with an external facilitator where possible to try and address the power dynamics in the room between funder and grantee. As mentioned previously, we have been working with TSIP and they have written a blog about their experience working with us on the co-design sessions. We'll just put the link in the chat if you are interested in finding out more. I'll now pass on to Shegufta, who will share the co-design experience under Propel.
Thanks, Khadra.
So just picking up on that last point, Propel really benefits from having London funders as a convener because they're able to operate more at arm's length from the funded work. And right from the outset, they engaged equity partners, which are made up of 5 organisations. So we've got here Inclusion London, Ubele, LGBT Consortium, and Women's Resource Centre. And these organisations have a variety of roles, including contributing to the programme design at both the strategic and operational level, as well as supporting organisations to access the funding. London funders also bring funded organisations together to facilitate contributions to the design of future programming. So funders like City Bridge Foundation can be strategically brought in and out of the conversation, allowing for spaces which are solely for the funded organisations, for them to sense check our ideas, contribute their own ideas, and hold us as operational staff accountable to the strategic ambitions and the principles of the collaboration. The Propel website has a "You Said, We Did" blog post from London funders, which outlines some of the achievements that this approach has had in the development of a strand of continuation funding, which we will share with you later on in the slides. Back to Clara.
Thank you. So in terms of what we're learning about infrastructure organisations, particularly those led by the communities they support, so we're still very much in the early days of the Anchor programme. The first round of funding was awarded towards the end of last year. So most of the Anchor funded organisations are roughly 6 months into their grant. But what we did learn during the carrying out the assessment visits is that many second-tier organisations have found themselves firefighting in the last few years, which means any systemic work such as research and/or policy work has taken a back seat. Sometimes organisations will get commissioned to carry out a specific type of research, but that means they have to stick to a specific framework and they don't have the freedom to research what they want to research or to respond to emerging needs. We also learned that it was really important for this fund to be targeting equity-led infrastructure organisations. We already know that equity-led organisations are often underfunded and face additional barriers to accessing funding. There's a great report out there by 360 Giving talking about the infrastructure sector. It was released in February last year. And it talks about the fact that we already know that, that in 2020, when funders were looking to make sure their emergency pandemic grant programs were reaching communities who needed it the most, the mechanisms to reach Black and minoritized-led organisations were not consistently available due to the reduction in number and capacity of equalities infrastructure organisations. So those infrastructure organisations that were still running were smaller than they were back in 2010 and lacked the capacity to scale up to respond to the high demands of funders and the sector. Without these infrastructure bodies, there was also less support available for Black and minoritized community groups responding to the crisis. Organisations also told us that building relationships with stakeholders, such as decision-making bodies, takes a lot of time and you need funding to be able to do this. We also learned that there are issues around recruitment and also having the capacity to collect data. I'll now hand over to Shegufta.
Thanks, Clara. So with regards to Propel, it wasn't targeted at infrastructure organisation, but many of those that received the larger level of funding went to infrastructure organisations. When it comes to systems change work, particularly where there's a focus on raising voice, developing policy, convening and growing partnerships, second-tier organisations are often best placed to start this work, and they certainly were when we launched Propel. So what this means is that many of the organisations were sort of developing the readiness for that large investment in systems change were the infrastructure organisation. The difference between Propel and Anchor is that up until now, Propel has been focused on project funding rather than core. Currently, the projects are all in their first year, so we've not yet had any reporting come back to us to be able to share with you. So what it means to take a relational approach to the application and assessment processes. So a general ambition at City Bridge Foundation is that being assessed isn't just based on the application form, but rather focusing on the assessment visits and calls and setting the scene so that you can have honest conversations and having follow-up calls to go over missing information instead of sending sort of lengthy emails back and forth. As Nat mentioned earlier, in Propel, we've been developing applications for continuation funding alongside the existing grantees. For our grantees that are already coming to the point of requesting an extension or expansion of their work, we're taking an approach that's quite different from our sort of standard business as usual. First of all, there's no application form. We know that we recently assessed these organisations. They will have gone through the due diligence process less than a year ago. So really, we're just asking for updates on anything that might have changed from when we first assessed them. We do have some exception to this within our financial due diligence because in the vast majority of cases, organisations are coming back and asking for significantly more money than we initially funded them for the first 12 months. And because we're still operating within our own internal systems in terms of reaching decisions and making grant agreements, in most cases, we're having to take them through a financial assessment. But otherwise, we're only asking for a budget, which they can use, we've got a template that they can use, or they can use whatever format they normally work with. We have been encouraging them to share a working document rather than creating something specifically for Propel. We also ask for a top-level work plan that gives a bit of shape as to what they plan to do over the next 2 years and help us understand how the budget relates to that. Everything else in terms of ambitions, how key learning is feeding into what we do going forward, what they're hoping to achieve. We're doing this very much on a one-to-one basis with each organisation. At the halfway point of their grant, we're meeting with them where they have, in most cases, have sort of generative conversations about achievements, ambitions, challenges, and what's going on in their specific context and how they think systems change focus is starting to form. We've also taken the onus on us in terms of we write up those meetings, we share it with them, and then we add them to the record for reference. And we're talking to them and testing their ideas with them and, sort of trying to figure out with them what will work best going forward. There are a few challenges with this. On the one hand, we're very fortunate that between Nat and I, we have quite a small portfolio of grantees than other funding manager colleagues that are working on our mainstream programs. And because 100% of our Explore funded organisations are user-led, what we had originally designed as a bespoke deadline, that is 3 months before the end of the 12-month period, getting their ideas solidified for a decision a month before it's due to end, this has had to shift. We've noticed that staff responsible for delivery and managing the grant are dealing with the same issues that the beneficiary communities face. And so this has led to quite a few sort of delays. We've had issues with staff turnover, and we've just had to be more adaptive in terms of timelines and the use of funds. Rather than arriving at a deadline with a fully formed application that they've spent 10 hours working on, this has taken place in conversation back and forth with us as a funder, and this stretches us out over a longer period of time. Some of the organisations have been keen to find ways to include beneficiaries in the application process, either speaking to us or co-producing the next stages of work, but this does also add towards the time spent. Our assumptions at the outset about the turnaround from the sort of halfway check-in to completing an application has been proven wrong because they were based on our expectations from traditional responsive programme turnaround times. Realistically, Explore grants were too short, even though it's the start of a longer term relationship, but 12 months is it's just not long enough. And even with a better process and trying to recreate what we have not been able to avoid recreating some of the fundraising cycle within Propel. Our ambition is that in the future, the longer term funding won't fall into those cycles. And in relation to this, our governance and processes are slow to keep up with our ambitions, to keep things simple for applicants. So whilst we don't have an application form, we still require provision of information, particularly financial, in formats that aren't really user-friendly. So all of this is ongoing. It hasn't been fully reviewed, so a pinch of salt is required for what organisations are telling us directly. But broadly, we've had feedback that this has been a positive experience, unlike maybe experiences they've had in the past for applying for funding. And we're really hoping that, there's a potential for how this can feed into the longer term nature of these relationships. Over to you, Khadra.
Thanks, Shegufta. So like Propel, we were committed to trialing ways of being more relational in the design, implementation and grant management of the Anchor programme. We asked how we could balance carving out space, time and different ways of working to become more relational if we ourselves are working in a system that's not always designed for this purpose. Our process of being relational is almost identical to Propel. One thing we would emphasize is that you can't award long-term funding without being relational. It's not a nice to have, it is essential. Things will change over the course of the grant, and you need to be able to adapt and support organisations through these changes. There are some challenges to being a more relational funder in practice. Yes, it takes more time, but the benefit of working closely with funded organisations allows us as funders to have a better understanding of issues on the ground, as well as ways we can improve our internal processes. It is also important to seek formal feedback from both successful and unsuccessful applicants about what works well and what doesn't. This helps us to reflect and embed changes that are needed to make our processes more equitable. Sometimes you might also have to have uncomfortable conversations or hear things that contradict your intentions to be more equitable. But again, this can only improve the work you're seeking to do. In round 1 of the Anchor programme, for example, we were able to get a good response rate from both successful and unsuccessful applicants on a survey that kind of shared more about the things that we should amend for round 2, such as not reviewing assessments over the summer period, so there is enough time for applicants to respond to urgent queries, not kind of in between annual leave processes. So initially, our intention as a funder was to try and expedite the process of organisations applying to receiving an outcome as soon as possible. And so that's why we assess over the summer, so that we can take recommendations to our September board and committee and get an outcome as soon as possible. However, we recognise that this meant that organisations maybe had lower kind of capacity over the summer period because some of their staff members were on annual leave, as well as funding managers assessing the applications. Some feedback we also received was kind of a lot around the kind of due diligence process, particularly around the financial review, and kind of asking City Bridge Foundation to consider doing that at an earlier stage of the assessment process, as well as providing a clear overview of what kind of due diligence documents are required before applicants were submitting their application forms. As part of the programme design of the Anchor Fund, we also agreed on a set of principles to help us be more relational, for example, being iterative and responding to the needs of all stakeholders, not just what works for us as the funder. I'll now pass on to Clara to close this presentation.
Thank you. We appreciate that we've covered a lot in this session. Both Propel and the Anchor programme benefit from being discrete programmes with healthy budgets. We also recognise that implementing ambitious programmes takes time, especially if you want to do it in an inclusive and co-designed way. When we think about the key words we've used, so we've spoken about long-term funding, being relational, supporting led by and for organisations, doing co-design work, it's important to highlight how all these elements interlink. For example, you can't do co-design work without being relational. In terms of what is the legacy for Propel and the Anchor programme, as the funding progresses, we'll hopefully have time to figure this out. A good start is by talking to other funders, sharing learnings and creating a sector-wide movement towards awarding long-term funding. We'd now like to open up the floor to any questions you might have. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Clara. If you want to just stop the screen share and then we can all come back together. Thanks so much for sharing all of that, all of you. I'm going to leave it open and see if there are any hands appearing, or feel free to come off mute if you want to share any reflections on what you've heard or have questions for the panel. Don't be shy. We've got about 10 minutes, so yeah, if you've got anything you want to ask or that's resonated with you, please jump in. Debbie and then Anya.
Hi, thank you. I thought that was really valuable, and large, longer funding, always something we're going to get behind. I was just wondering, you mentioned that you provided additional training to your grants managers to help them become more comfortable with providing longer term grants, and I just wondered whether you could elaborate on that a little. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. So we tried a couple of new things. We had a group of funding managers that were helping us to assess anchor assessment applications, and we introduced a buddy system where we would pair the funding managers up with another funding manager so that they would be working collectively on an assessment. We also encouraged them to do assessment visits in pairs. And we organised some systems change training for the funding managers to talk specifically about systems change and the impact that core funding can have, and to kind of prepare ourselves and them for the types of applications we were going to be assessing. We also wanted to create a space. We had weekly check-ins with the funding managers so that we could discuss the applications we were working on, and also a space to, perhaps talk about anything that they were struggling with, they needed more support with, and things like that. So we tried to make it a little bit more collaborative, how we carried out the assessments. Our usual process at CBF is that we work individually on an assessment. Of course, we talk to each other. We have weekly meetings as a team, but each funding manager manages kind of their own portfolio of grants. So yeah, we tried to change it up a little bit, and we got good feedback. So we will be keeping the same way of assessing for the second round of the anchor programme.
Thank you.
Just to add to that, if I may, we were also able to support funding managers in the write-ups of the assessments that they reviewed. So as we mentioned earlier, at the end of the assessment period, funding managers are expected to complete an assessment report, which is essentially a recommendation for funding to our committee and board. So another thing we were able to do through those systems change training, as well as working collectively as a kind of the peer support element, was to be able to kind of communicate more complex ideas around core funding and systems change work to people perhaps who weren't as involved in the assessment as the funding managers were.
Thanks, Khadra. We'll come to Anya, and then I will come to the question from Kat in the chat. Thanks.
Thanks, Helen. The thing I'm really kind of, I suppose, keen to hear a little bit more about was the approach to getting trustees or sort of decision makers on board, and sort of to support the move to this approach or this way of working. And so it'd be interesting to hear, I suppose, what were sort of maybe the main concerns that they had at the beginning of the process, and some of the kind of key things that you thought were important to get across to be able to make the case for longer term funding.
Who would like to take this question? I can start. It's a great question. Thank you. I think it's important to say that our committee overall were really supportive of the anchor programme. We we weren't in a situation where we were having to convince them that this was a good idea. There's so much evidence already out there. You know, one of the funding directors at CBF wrote an excellent paper on 10-year grants on long-term funding with lots of evidence to show the need for this in the sector. So I think the questions we got asked were more kind of were more around systems change aspect. So going into a bit more detail as to kind of what we meant by systems change. And then there were specific questions on individual assessments that funding managers were presenting. I'll be honest, I've blocked a lot of it out. So I can't remember what kind of was highlighted because it was adrenaline was high, as you can imagine.
I could just add to that I think one key thing that has enabled us to progress to 10-year funding is that we have kind of gradually over time increased the period of time that we funded over. So in our older strategy, investing in Londoners that had a maximum of 3, we managed to increase to 5. And I think it helped that we'd had those, as I mentioned, sporadic longer term funding relationships with a lot of infrastructure organisations, in which we were able to demonstrate actually we've had long-term relationships with organisations for a long time that have been successful. And actually many of the sort of risk management processes that we already have in place already deal with a lot of the kind of things that you might worry about. So we already monitor things closely annually. We already only release grants quarterly and things like that. That really meant that actually, other than the sort of the framing of the programs around system change and in Anchor's case core funding and making sure that we can assess for those purposes, in terms of the risk of releasing that or committing that much funding at once, we already have really robust monitoring and financial measurement processes in place.
I was just going to add to that as well. I think Anchor is the first program at CBF that has been offering core funding at scale. And again, you know, we know there's so much evidence out there as to why core funding is needed. I think COVID and the sort of the work that we did through the London Community Response and the London Community Response Fund, which again convened by London funders, that meant that we were working at pace, and we sort of shifted to offering core funding because within that context, we knew that that was what organisations needed. And I think some of that took away the sort of the fear or the risk side of, you know, that's not how we've done it before. I think the board and committee were quite, you know, I think they took comfort in, you know, what we were able to do under those sort of emergency circumstances and how well it went, and how we didn't want to just go back to how we were doing things pre-COVID, but rather building on the success of all of that.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Kat's question in the chat, which is around the co-design group. So you mentioned that trust building with your co-design group required you to build informal spaces for connection with them. Can you talk a bit more about the kinds of spaces that you created? I don't know who wants to take that. Khadra.
Thanks, Helen. So I guess the first thing to say is this can happen both in person and online as well. We recognise that for some organisations it's not always easy to kind of commit to in-person sessions, even though we've kind of emerged from the lockdown reality of the past few years. I think it's about not overthinking building trust and relationships, and just really giving people the space to share more about who they are beyond their job titles and the work that they do within their organisation. And so part of it, I guess it really depends on the group you're working with as well. If there's like a shared interest there, then perhaps you would tailor that trust building exercise to what they have in common. If it's a more diverse group of people and organizations, then it's kind of thinking about kind of multiple things that they might have in common. I think one thing we did is just ask people to share things about themselves personally. So, you know, we would start a session by asking people, you know, we recognize that you might be having a really busy day and we really appreciate you joining this session. There might be things that are kind of occupying your mind. If you want to share that with us so that we recognize what space you are in currently and kind of how you're coming to this meeting, then it's important to do so. We also would just have, like, if we are meeting in person, making sure you have really great snacks and like kind of bringing food into the element and kind of allowing people to just have a cup of tea together, and creating, I guess, a space before the session for people to just talk without there being a set agenda. I think it's really important. So that's quite a not a very clear answer, but I guess it's really just understanding the people you're working with. And I think also being mindful of their past experiences with working with funders, and kind of being really open and managing expectations of what is possible and what might not be possible, and committing to that throughout the process of the co-design period. So when you get things wrong or someone has fed that back, then sharing it with the rest of the group, and kind of talking about why you think that might have gone wrong and what you're hoping to do in the future to avoid similar issues.
Thanks, Khadra. We've got 2 minutes left. I'm just going to see if there are any more questions, any final questions anyone wants to bring up. While you have a think, I will just make everyone aware as well. There's quite a few links that have been put in the chat to some of the reports and briefings that the panel referred to. So please do make a note of that if you can. Okay, well, we're doing very well on time, so I'm conscious of everyone's busy days. So unless there are any burning things anyone wants to ask, I'm going to wrap up firstly by thanking Nat, Khadra, Clara, Shegufta. Thanks so much for sharing the learning and talking about those 2 programs. And thank you to everyone else as well for joining. Hope you found it useful. I think so much we're talking about systems change, I think, as a sector much more now. So I think it's always really helpful to hear how it's kind of how you've been trying to implement some of those ambitions. And definitely a favourite takeaway quote of mine, if it doesn't feel complex, then we're not doing it right. So I think then embracing some of that messiness, as you said, is also how we learn and how change is achieved. So yeah, that was really good. Thanks so much, everybody. Do sign up for the remaining sessions. And hope to see you soon. Thanks for joining us.